expect you to write promises. It's not something you would normally do. And what I mean by that is this particular function is a promise that was written ahead of time. And usually promises are something that you just use someone else's code like this, and you use it down here like this. So I'm not going to have you type it in, but I want to show you how it works. So if you ever have to use a promise, you'll have seen it. Very similar to the fact that we did Ajax, and I made you do that XML HTTP object just so you'd understand how it works. When in actuality, you'll probably not ever need it in this way, but I just want you to understand it so I can move along with it. So what I'm going to do is, and you can follow along with if you want, I've loaded this page in my browser, and I'm going to look in my DevTools. And I'm going to go to Debugger. And depending on which browser you're in, you might need to find that file. But both of them have a debugger tool. I'm going to hit refresh so that my page shows up here. And then make my screen a little bit smaller so we can see this in action. And what I want to do is give you the opportunity to catch up with me, but I want to walk through the code as the browser walks through it so you'll get a visual for what a promise is doing. Okay? So I'm going to use my debugger tool, and I want you to recognize that I'm creating an instance of a promise, which is a class somebody else has written that I'm utilizing to make my world a little bit easier, as you'll see. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a breakpoint on two pieces of this code. I'm going to put one on line 14, which is the first line inside this new promise. So as this promise is being created, I have to put one line down. As this promise is being created, I'm going to walk through so I can see what's happening. And I'm also going to put a breakpoint down here on Ask Mom. And I'm hoping you guys are familiar with the debugger tools. And the idea here is that I can walk through the line of code line by line as the browser is interpreting it. So I can kind of get in the mind's eye of the interpreter as this page is being rendered line by line in the order in which it's rendered. So let me refresh this page and see what happens. All right, my debugger has stopped. It stopped on this line, which means that the very first thing that the interpreter is trying to do is to instantiate this instance of the promise. So we haven't called our promise, we're simply instantiating it. And what you're going to notice is that a promise's job is to return two pieces of data. Very similar to what we just did in the last example of our callback. Once the promise is run, the promise is going to return and call this function after the promise is finished. And if it was successful, it's going to put the success in this word resolve. And if it was unsuccessful, it's going to put its unsuccess, its error in this variable called reject. So this is a callback function. Promise is going to do something. In our case, it's going to end up calling our get request for our Ajax call, but we're going to get to that. I'm just trying to give you a visual of why I would use it. And so when that Ajax call gets returned, it's either going to be resolved successfully or it's going to come back with an error. So this gives me the ability to catch either one, and it's the promise's job to fill in these two variables. So this is the promise. I'm kind of making a fake promise just to kind of give you an idea of how it would be working. And so if we look up in here, our variable is false. Mom is unhappy. So I'm going to step through the code. So that's quote an error. It's not really, but we're making it an error. You can see that a new error is being thrown because mom is unhappy. And so I'm going to step through this code a little bit more. Let me undo this highlight. Step through the code a little bit more. And now you're going to see that the promise filled in the reject with the error. Okay. So what was returned from the promise is going to return into will get new phone. Let me see if I can actually show that. Will get new phone got returned with the reason and the error. So if I look at this, then what was returned was the error message that we indicated over here. How do I know that? Well, let's watch. So now ask mom. So the variable is set, and we should now ask mom. So we're going to run the code. Will get new phone is rejected. It was an error. And so the way that we use a promise, and this is how you will end up using it, is once you call a promise, there's this thing called after the promise is run, .then is run automatically if the promise was resolved correctly. It returns something correctly, or in our case, it's going to do the .catch because we sent an error. And let's just verify that. So at the end of the day, we should see console log error message. I'm going to finish out the script. And I go to the console, and it does say, here's the error, because remember, it threw an error. The promise threw an error, because we forced that. And so it printed out, mom is not happy. So let's just watch the opposite happen, and we'll return a true. So in other words, our promise is going to go do something, and it's going to return a true because we're kind of forcing that point. I'm going to go back into the debugger, refresh it, and now let's see what happens. So I have my two variables set up, the resolve and reject. In this case, the function is returning a true because mom is happy. Yay, mom. And so these things are going to get filled. Resolve is getting filled with a phone object, and we can see that happening here. So when we're finished with this, will I get a new phone is got an object and a result in the resolve argument. And so now, when this function gets run, there's our promise with the syntax, our promise dot then. So this is if that condition were rendered true. In other words, if resolve got a true, which it did do it successfully. So now we should get something along these lines. And so if we look at our code now, we should have, oh, nothing, I don't think I finished it. Maybe that's my problem. And now I lost the whole thing. Debugger, finish that up. All right, and now we should have our object. Okay, does that make sense?